What is up, everybody? I'm Get Flanked, and I put out a poll on my YouTube channel recently asking which side has the better guns in Rainbow Six Siege, attackers or defenders. 72% of the people who responded said attackers, and I think that lines up pretty much with what I was expecting. I think that most people would say that if you look as a whole at attackers versus defenders, attackers have the better guns, the more powerful guns. But I want to talk to you today about why I think that isn't necessarily true in the way that Siege actually plays out, and why this is a source of a lot of the problems that Rainbow Six Siege is experiencing right now from a balancing perspective. Let me first say that I understand why 72% of the people who responded to that poll said that attackers have the best gun. And if you look at the comparison of attackers versus defender guns on paper, I believe that attackers do have the overall best weapons. There isn't a single defender gun that I would say can compete with the F2 or the AK-12 or the SC-3000K. The fact is that many of the attacker guns are more powerful than any of the defender guns. However, I want you to take a look at this image that I have up on the screen right now. I'm showing a two-team compositions, one for attackers on top, one for defenders on the bottom. In this round of Rainbow Six Siege, which side has the better guns? I think you can make a very, very strong argument that the defenders in this round have the better guns, at least at this point in Siege's history. Now, keep in mind, two of those guns are the Roni. That's getting nerfed in the test server. One of those guns is the MX4 Storm. That's getting nerfed in the test server. And this might not be the case forever, but at this point in Siege's history, and for much of Siege's life, I would argue that the defenders in this round have the better guns. And while on paper, attackers overall have the better guns, that might not be the way that the rounds are actually playing out in Siege. Now, I'm not trying to say that the team composition I showed there is the most realistic. I mean, defenders in that round didn't even have any wall denial, so keep that in mind. I'm just trying to demonstrate that while attackers may in reality have the overall better weapons, it doesn't matter if those weapons aren't being brought. You know, what matters is the guns that are being brought and how these rounds are playing out in Siege. And I would argue that because of the meta and because of the fact that defenders have more flexibility in the operators they can pick, on average, defenders are bringing better guns than what attackers are in any given round of Siege. Now, why is this a problem? Well, defenders have a lot of inherent advantages in Siege, and I've talked about Siege being a defender-sided game many times on the channel. But as far as what those inherent advantages are, I mean, first of all, there's one more win condition for defenders, in that if attackers don't make something happen by either killing the entire enemy team or planting the diffuser, then defenders win the round, okay? Defenders get full map control for the entire prep phase to run around and set up their reinforcements, set up their utility, and put themselves in positions without fear of death for 40 seconds, even before the attackers spawn in. Defenders have more utility that can have an impact after their death than what attackers do. Let's compare Kapkan with Thermite. Kapkan can set down all 5 of his traps in the prep phase. He can die in the first second of the round and still get kills even after he's dead throughout that entire round. You look at Thermite, if Thermite dies in the first second of a round, all of his utility is gone other than maybe a drone that he has set up somewhere. So, you know, those attackers have a much harder time impacting the round from the grave than what defenders do. Attackers also have the burden of having to make noise in order to enter the map, for the most part. There's a few exceptions there, like Bank Garage. An attacker can technically come through Garage and enter that map without actually making any noise. But for the most part, if an attacker is going to enter the map, they have to make noise by destroying a barricade or something like that. And that's going to give the defenders a lot of information. Now, to try to balance out these inherent defender advantages that exist in Siege, they gave the attackers a couple things. I think the first thing I would mention there is the drone. You can make the argument that the drone is the single strongest piece of utility in the game if used correctly. And some attackers have 2, some attackers have even more if you look at like Flores or Twitch. So that's a big thing going in favor of the attackers. They also gave the attackers the more powerful weapons. Now, I think that wording is more powerful is important. For the most part, the attacker weapons do more damage per bullet, And for the most part, attackers have the more powerful zoomed optic choices on their weapons. It's not true in every scenario, but for the most part, I think that you can say that those two things are true. On the attacker side, their weapons are more powerful and they have the better optic options than what defenders do. So when you look at attacker guns versus defender guns in Rainbow Six Siege, I think you can see that the design philosophy was we're going to give attackers these strong ARs that do more damage per bullet but have more recoil, and we're going to give defenders these SMGs that have higher fire rate with less recoil but don't do as much damage per bullet. There are outliers on both sides, of course, but for the most part, I do think that general statement is true. The problem with this design philosophy in Siege, with defenders having the SMGs, attackers having the ARs, is that the one-shot headshot mechanic in Siege throws kind of an X factor into weapon balance. And as you're looking at guns in Siege, what stats are the most important? Is it damage per bullet? Is it fire rate? Is it recoil? Is it magazine capacity? It's a really tough question to answer. I think a lot of people gravitate towards the time to kill stat in Siege. And I'll say this. I think that the time to kill stat is probably the most dependable single stat line you can look at for weapon balance in Siege to try to judge how strong a weapon is. But it doesn't tell the full story because of that one-shot headshot mechanic and the fact that somewhere around 40% of your kills are going to be headshot kills. It differs per player, of course, but that's kind of the number that I generally associate with is somewhere around, we'll say 35 to 40% of the kills in Rainbow Six Siege are headshot kills. So in those headshot kill scenarios, it doesn't really matter whether the gun you're using does 1 damage per bullet or 100 damage per bullet. One shot is going to get you the kill. It doesn't matter if the time to kill for that gun is 0.2 seconds or 5 seconds. One shot and one mouse click is going to get you that kill because of the one-shot headshot mechanic. Now, I realize that some of those headshot kills are instances where maybe you landed two body shots first and then the third bullet landed on the head. That's still a headshot kill, but technically, that bullet landing anywhere would have resulted in that kill. I get it. It's not perfect. But I think what this does demonstrate is that it's really tough to look at single stat lines in Siege and judge what makes a strong weapon. But I think you can almost certainly say that damage per bullet is not the most important stat line in Siege because in somewhere around 40% of the gunfights in Siege, damage per bullet does not matter due to those headshots. Now listen, I realize we've kind of gone in the weeds now. We're talking about some nerdy, weapon stats in Siege. If you stuck with me this long, I greatly appreciate it. So let me throw kind of a black and white summary of what I'm getting at right now. If I have two guns in Siege and one has a high damage per bullet with a higher recoil and a lower fire rate, and I'm having to choose between that and a gun that has lower damage per bullet with higher fire rate and lower recoil, I think the gun with lower damage per bullet, high fire rate, low recoil is a much more desirable weapon in Siege due to that one-shot headshot mechanic. And with that thought process, you can make a very strong argument that the defenders in any given round of Siege are more likely to have the better weapons than what attackers are. And if that's one of the core fundamental balance design elements of Siege, that the attackers are supposed to have the better weapons, but in reality, defenders in fact have the better weapons, it's no wonder that Siege is such a defender-sided game. Let me give you kind of a real world example of what I'm talking about now. This clip that you're seeing on the screen right now is from a recent match that I played. And what you're going to see here is I come up to the top of the stairs as mute using the MP5K, and I hear the Ash coming from the piano way. So I turn that direction and I start pre-firing this door where I think the Ash is going to come from. And I believe that I land a headshot right around the 11th, 12th bullet, somewhere around in there. And I'm able to do that because even though I'm firing full auto, there's not much recoil on the MP5, so I'm able to keep the crosshair right around head height, and eventually that high fire rate on the MP5K lands me a headshot. Now, what I did, this was actually on stream, and what I did was I went back into a custom game and I started reproducing that with the MP5 and then compared it to the R4C. The R4C has significantly more recoil than the MP5. So in that scenario right there, playing as the Mute with an MP5K, which I think is a good defender weapon, but I wouldn't necessarily consider it like S tier, I would make the argument that in that scenario, that MP5K was a better weapon than that R4C. And you know, there are situations where the R4C is going to be better, of course. I'm not claiming that, you know, the high damage per bullet never matters, okay? But I think that in the way that gunfights are currently playing out, the meta in Siege, the fact that for the most part, fights in Siege take place in that 8, 9, 10 meter range, the SMGs with the higher fire rate, lower recoil, will give you an advantage over many of the more powerful attacker weapons. And this discussion right now is what has led to a lot of frustration in Siege. I mentioned it earlier in the video. They are currently in the test server nerfing the Roni and the MX4 Storm. This has led to a lot of frustration within the Siege community. And I get it. I really do. But I also understand where the developers are coming from. If you have these defender weapons that are outperforming attacker weapons, that's a real problem. If the core fundamental design element of Siege is that attackers need to have the better weapons in order to compensate for the inherent advantages that defenders have, and that is in fact not true, that's a problem. And that's a problem that needs fixed. Now, I think that they could go about fixing it better. And in my opinion, something I'd like to see them do is come out and talk about this and say something along the lines of, we're going to try out increasing defender recoil across the board by 20%. And I'm just throwing numbers out. And they tried on the test server, okay? A lot of people are talking now about removing one-shot headshots and stuff like that. I don't think that would be necessarily the best way to go. I do consider the one-shot headshot a core fundamental element of Siege. But I do think that they could make a statement where they do increase defender recoil across the board. If we go back to that situation with Mute and the MP5K, if after the first 4 or 5 bullets of me firing full auto and pre-firing, if I'm not getting a kill in those first 4 or 5 bullets, I think the penalty should be more severe. That recoil should start getting worse and worse and worse to the point where it's unreliable and I need to stop firing and reset in order to consistently land bullets where I want them to go. I think that would benefit the game, an increase in recoil across the board on defender weapons. I think there will be some exceptions. For example, the Scorpion probably doesn't need more recoil, and I think they'd have to look at how they roll this out on console. But I think that as long as the defenders have the flexibility to bring the better guns, while attackers have to bring the stronger utility, putting them in positions where they have worse guns, you're going to see this problem exist in Siege. And I'd like to see them mess around with the recoil specifically on defender weapons to see if maybe that could solve this problem and put Siege in a place where attackers do have that advantage of having the better guns in more scenarios. All right, guys, that's going to do it for the video. Again, I know that we kind of nerded out here. If you made it this long into the video, it's greatly appreciated. Let me know in the comments if you did and what you think about this whole topic. What I'm talking about here is very opinionated in the sense that, like I said, it's really tough to look at gun stats in Siege and see what's the most important. You can make an argument that damage per bullet is more important in Siege than fire rate. I think you can. It can go both ways. I just feel like the way that Siege is playing out right now, high fire rate, low recoil, is the most desirable elements of a gun in Siege over damage per bullet. So let me know what you think. If you disagree, I'm really excited to hear all that. Do you like the idea of messing around with defender recoil across the board in one patch, and trying it on the test server, seeing what that feels like? Do you think that there should be a bigger penalty for going full auto in Siege? I want to hear all that in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure that you like and subscribe, and I'll have more coming your way here soon.